The chances are, if you're watching this video, then you already know that Batman the Animated Series is arguably the best interpretation of Batman in any media, and yes, I'm including the comics. I could easily go on for hours about how the show's striking art design, sensational scripts, phenomenal voice acting, and breathtaking music combined to make this one of the best TV shows of all time. But I wanted to take the time today to talk about a specific topic that interests me. As a lifelong fan of Batman, one of the things I truly appreciate about this show is how faithful to the spirit of the character the show is, without being a slave to the established continuity. The creators of the show took all of the best things from the comics and dropped the accumulated gubbins that had built up over the decades. I'll hand over to Batman the Animated Series story editor Marty Pascal in an interview from Batman the Animated Podcast to explain their philosophy.
In our approach to the show, what we did is say, we are not going to be bound by any comics fans' idea of canon. We have a rich mythology here that goes back, at that point it was 60 years. And we said, why not just cherry pick from the best of it? And if some of the stuff is best in terms of conception, but might be played a little bit hokey because the comics are old, we don't need to be bound by that. So what we decided was, we'll take elements of the villains from the comics. But if they needed to have a new backstory, if we needed to flesh out something that was only hinted at in the comics, we weren't bound by the comics.
A great example of this is their version of Mr. Freeze. The original comic book character was a generic, cult-themed villain that had no real motivations beyond accumulating wealth. Enter Paul Dini, writer of the famed episode Heart of Ice, who transformed Mr. Freeze into a tragic character, looking to seek revenge on the heartless industrialist that was responsible for the death of his wife. This version of Mr. Freeze has been discussed at length, and rightly so. But that's not what I'm here to talk about today. Instead, I want to talk about something similar that they did with another member of Batman's amazing rogues gallery. Let's talk about Clayface. To understand the brilliance of BTAS's version of Clayface, you first need to be aware of how ridiculously convoluted the characters' backstories were in the comic book. In 1992, when the show first aired, there were a total of 4 separate Clayfaces, and I'm going to try to give you the whistle-stop tour of them all right now. The first Clayface, named Basil Karlo, the name a reference to the movie stars Boris Karloff and Basil Rathbone, made his debut in 1940s Detective Comics number 40. Basil was a deranged actor and a makeup artist who went on a rampage when one of his movies was remade without his involvement. He donned the mask of a villain from one of his previous films, Clayface, and goes about stabbing people involved in the production of the new film. Bruce Wayne's fiancée at the time, Julie Madison, had been cast in this film, so when her co-stars started turning up dead, it drew the attention of Batman and Robin. Clayface only appeared a handful of times and was generally very easily disposed of because he possessed no supernatural abilities. Although about 50 years later, Karlo returned in a story called The Mud Pack, which teamed all of the Clayfaces together to defeat the Dark Knight. Karlo schemed to take blood samples from the other Clayfaces and injected it into himself, making him the ultimate Clayface. And later on he developed some piezoelectric powers. I'm not even sure if I'm saying that right, but it sucked. The second Clayface debuted in 1961 with a far more outlandish premise. A treasure hunter named Matt Hagen found a mysterious pool of protoplasmic ooze in an underwater cavern and promptly fell into it. Upon emerging from the ooze, he discovered that his body had been transformed into a clay-like substance that allowed him to morph into anything he could think of for 48 hours. This version of Clayface is a petty thief who, despite having these fantastic powers, only really wants to live a life of luxury, and so he spends much of his time turning into fantastic beasts in order to scare people away, allowing him to pillage jewellery stores, art galleries and banks. At later stages in his stories, he developed a synthetic version of the substance that gave him his powers, but the effect was more limited and became less effective after prolonged use. This Hagen is addicted to his power and goes to any lengths to maintain it. Hagen was killed off, reduced to a puddle of goop during the 1980s Crisis on Infinite Earths crossover event. The third Clayface, Preston Payne, debuted in 1978 with a far more sympathetic backstory and motivations. Payne was born with a disease that left him physically deformed and an outcast in society. While he was highly intelligent and became a scientist at Star Labs, conventional medicine could do nothing for him. In desperation for a normal life, basically read that as him going on dates with pretty ladies, Payne visited Matt Hagen in prison and took a blood sample with the intent of unlocking the secrets of his power. Hagen had never disclosed how he became Clayface, and so believed there'd be no harm in giving this scientist a blood sample. However, Payne was able to isolate a strange substance from Hagen's blood and promptly injected himself with it. Although the early results were promising, he was able to make himself handsome and arrange a date with a nameless pretty lady. The effect was short-lived and his body began to melt. His date, shrieking in horror, attempted to flee, only for Payne to grab her arm, causing her to melt into a pool of unrecognisable protoplasm. Payne was anguished to realise that his touch was fatal to other people and that his body was falling apart. Using his scientific knowledge, he constructed a suit to maintain his form and keep his disease to himself, although he periodically has to infect people or else he experiences incredible pain. He was driven mad by this condition and eventually took residence in Arkham Asylum with a mannequin he named Helena, believing her to be the only woman immune to his touch. The fourth Clayface, Sondra Fuller, debuted in 1987, and she was a woman that only wanted to be beautiful. So unhappy was she with her own appearance, she allowed the snake-worshipping cult Cobra to experiment on her. She was transformed into the new Clayface, Lady Clay. In her case, the change is permanent, like Payne, and while she can mimic anyone's appearances, she is also able to mimic the powers of the superheroes she impersonates for a short time. In BTAS, the writers took elements from all four Clayfaces and created a composite Clayface. Their Clayface was an actor, like the original Clayface, but they named him Matt Hagen after the second Clayface. Similar to the second Clayface, their Clayface used a strange substance to alter his appearance for a short period of time, and he was addicted to it. Finally, they took the permanent transformation and desire to be good looking from Clayface 3, and to a lesser extent 4. Of course, with their character being a movie star and this show being set in the perpetual 1940s, it was impossible for the team to resist referencing classic Hollywood. There are two actors that I believe were a big inspiration for BTAS's Clayface, and let's start with the really obvious one. Lon Chaney. In the episode Beware the Grey Ghost, Matt Hagen is referenced on the cover of a magazine, and he's referred to as the man of a million faces. This is a clear reference to silent movie star Lon Chaney, the man of 1,000 faces. Simple math dictates that Hagen is therefore 1,000 times better than Chaney. Now, Lon Chaney was a horror master and a pioneer at the art of movie makeup during the silent era. He most notably played the Phantom of the Opera and the Hunchback of Notre Dame, and he designed the makeup and applied the makeup for these characters himself, which was unheard of. So vast was his knowledge of theatrical makeup that he wrote the entry on the topic for the 14th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica. And if we look at Matt Hagen's deformity in BTAS, I can see clear parallels with Chaney's Phantom, especially that deformed nose. And this reference is pretty easy to spot if you know anything about classic Hollywood, especially when Glenn Murakami, one of the main character designers on BTAS and an eventual director of episodes, posts multiple pictures of Chaney's Phantom of the Opera on his Instagram. So the references to Chaney, I think, are quite obvious, but I think I've spotted a more subtle reference to another tragic Hollywood figure of yesteryear. I want to take the time to talk about the late great Montgomery Clift. Edward Montgomery Clift was a Hollywood heartthrob of the 1950s who worked with cinema legends like Marlon Brando, Marilyn Monroe and Elizabeth Taylor. He was a hugely influential actor at the time, working in a very realistic, casual style that wowed audiences, and it didn't hurt that he was easy on the eye. However, Clift suffered a severe facial injury after a car crash in 1956 that left his face forever changed. While he wasn't as disfigured as Hagen, it altered the symmetry of his face, leaving the left side partially paralysed and puffy looking, while at the same time aging him dramatically. His friend Kevin McCarthy, who by the way voiced Dr. Long in the BTAS episode Nothing to Fear, witnessed the crash and later described Clift's injury as if his face had been torn off. Clift sadly self-medicated with alcohol and pills and spiralled downwards in what acting coach Robert Lewis called the longest suicide in Hollywood history. Ultimately, he died of a heart attack in 1966, aged 45, brought on by over a decade of substance abuse. There is a really strong physical similarity between Matt Hagen and Monty Clift. I mean, just look at those eyebrows. But the similarities are just too much if you know about them. One other thing that Monty Clift is well known for these days is for being perceived as a tragic queer figure. In the late 1980s, a handful of salacious biographies were published that revealed intimate details about Clift's personal life, and in recent years this view of Clift has been challenged, particularly by a documentary called Making Montgomery Clift, made by his nephew Robert Clift and his wife. The reason I bring this up is because Clayface is undeniably a tragic gay-coded figure, at least according to Kevin Altieri, who directed Feet of Clay Part 2.
Like, I didn't come up with Clayface. That was the script. And Matt Hagen, and of course you got Ron Perlman doing that voice. It's like, and that performance is like, this ham actor this is someone that you've met, you know. That's someone that we all know, and that's why it's so effective. Yeah, and it's a tragic end, but then again, only for what's his name? Only for his
his boyfriend?
Yeah. His boyfriend. And that was intentionally a gay relationship too.
Does he throw a whiskey bottle at him in that episode? I feel like
I
remember that relationship.
It's like a
being
dark
really
play.
real and visceral.
Yeah.
It's like a little slice of Tennessee Williams or something.
No,
Yeah.
it's like I gave those a lot of that stuff between those two. I gave to Brad Rader, and he just knocked it out of the park.
Yeah, it felt like an abusive relationship. It was
like he comes into the room, you know, this guy comes to the room with like a turkey dinner. It's like, that wasn't in the script. He was like, I think, you know, it was like that Brad said, no, this guy went out of his way to try and please
I
me.
made you an entire Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Please don't scream at me.
Don't you dare patronize me!
Okay, great. Well, drop the clay down his throat.
So, according to Kevin Altieri, it was the writers that came up with the characterization of Clayface, although he and the artists took the ball and ran with it. As you can tell from this video so far, Justin Michael's Batman the Animated podcast has been an invaluable resource to me. Several years ago, I submitted a question to Dan Rieber, who was credited as a character designer on Feet of Clay, and directed several other episodes, to ask if Monty Clift was a direct inspiration for Hagen.
One thing I wondered for years, and Dan may be just the man to ask, is if any of the characters were inspired by real people. For instance, Matt Hagen reminds me of Monty Clift, a famous actor that was disfigured in a car accident and a massive drug addict. And Rupert Thorne looks just like Marlon Brando.
Yes and yes.
Okay.
I'm almost positive that that's the Monty Clift. I mean, Bruce is a big movie buff. I'm not absolutely positive that it's Monty Clift, but I'm pretty sure he thought of that.
That little hesitation at the end left me with a slight doubt, but it was while researching this video I came across an article written to commemorate the show's 25th anniversary in Back Issue magazine number 99. The article, written by comics journalist and my Twitter chum, John Trumbull, is a great summary of the creation of the show. While it has been long sold out in print, it is still readily available digitally. In fact, I have it saved on my phone. There are a number of great quotes from all of the living key players, but one thing that jumped out of me is this quote from story editor Marty Pascoe. I asked Alan if I could put aside trying to rewrite these things and break some new stories to get us caught up. I pitched him a two-parter to get ahead faster. 1, approval for the price of 2. The Clayface intro, Feet of Clay, a title I'm very proud of. I plotted it and wrote the outline and got it approved. I then brought in Marv Wolfman to script part 1 and Michael Reeves to script part 2. Guys Alan had never worked with before. So, it seems to me, if this was an intentional reference to Monty Clift, Marty Pascoe would be the guy to ask. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2020, so we'll probably never really be able to know for certain if the reference to Monty Clift was intentional or not. But I'm going to continue to believe it to be the case. It's easy to do, especially when you look at the recently revealed variant cover for Batman The Adventures Continue Season 3 Number 1, a comic book continuation of the BTAS universe, and it's due to be released in January 23. This cover by Steve Beach is a powerfully grotesque image capturing one of the most memorable and disturbing scenes from the entire series. It's made all the more unnerving for me because I recognise those agonised eyes peering out at us from the clay.